The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've been saying for years, if you believe that Democrats and Republicans are the same on every issue, you are truly very seriously wrong. But it is true that on lots of issues, there are really no practical operational differences between Democrats and Republicans. And one of those areas is basically what I call the default unquestioning funding of the military industrial complex and defense spending, many times merely questioning whether we should continually spend more and more money on the military and defense. Merely asking the question is considered unpatriotic. Some right-wingers would have you believe that it's bordering on treason to question military and defense spending. And the Democrats mostly are complicit yet again. 89% of the Democrats in the Senate have helped Republicans to pass another huge, perverse, depraved expansion of the military, despite the reality that we already have a bigger military than we could ever possibly need. $700 billion additional dollars have been approved for the military over the next 10 years. This would give the American military a larger budget than they had at any point during the entirety of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And this passed 89-8. 89-8. The sometimes Democratic hero, John McCain, a Republican senator, was at the forefront of asking for more money, saying if we don't grow the military, if we don't feed it more money, we risk losing our edge over the militaries of other countries. There are still some details here to be sorted out, but actually getting the money to the military is more or less the only one. Otherwise, this is going to happen. And the Democrats are right there. In the House back in July, about 60% of Democrats voted in favor of this. And now 41 out of the 46 Democratic senators voted in favor. That is more than 89% of them. Here's some real bipartisanship, right? Republicans and almost all Democrats can agree, let's give even more money to the military. This is why progressives aren't happy with the Democratic Party, among countless other reasons. Progressives need to see the Democratic Party sort of as a tool in the shed or an arrow in the quiver, not as the path to a more progressive country, because a huge portion of the Democratic Party on some really major issues cannot be counted on to do the progressive thing. And in the meantime, by the way, $700 billion for the military. Once you're talking about $700 billion, you're talking about numbers big enough to maybe fund Bernie's so-called free college program. That was going to cost something like $47 billion a year. This is $700 billion over 9 or 10 years. You're talking about not being able to afford better health care covering everybody, but on a whim, you can expand the already most expensive military in the world.
Right. When you talk about universal health care or maybe free college, everyone asks, how are you going to pay for it? But you don't have to give that justification when it comes to increased defense spending.
No. Oh, if you ask the question, you're doing something wrong by asking.
And all you have to say is, well, you know, this affords us the other freedoms that we have, right? Because we have such a strong military, we're able to pay for health care and free college and everything else. And then there's never a follow-up.
There's never a follow-up. There's never any serious conversation about it. And the other question I have for the Democratic senators is, Republicans didn't really need this many Democratic votes. Couldn't some Democrats have voted against this on principle? Or are even the Democratic senators afraid that they will be cast as unpatriotic by their opponents when it's time for their own reelection campaigns? That's probably part of it, because they were going to pass this.
Well, I think it's because this new version of the NDAA stalls Trump's transgender ban. So maybe some Democrats thought of that as a worthy enough concession to pass this $700 billion bill.
Give another $700 billion, but you stall, not stop the transgender ban. That's interesting.
It's an important issue, but it's just not good enough.
It's not good. And of course, there's no reason these things have to be connected, as always with American politics. And the bottom line is, the problem that applies to mostly all senators is that the military-industrial complex does create jobs, right? Giving $700 billion extra dollars to the military It will maintain some jobs, contractor jobs, weapons manufacturers jobs, and maybe it's tough for these Democratic senators to go back to their districts, particularly ones, and this isn't everybody, but it's many of them, that have these contractors and companies in their districts and explain why now 100 jobs don't exist because they voted against another $700 billion for the military. The entire system is the problem here.
Well, much like on healthcare, with this, we've learned that politics makes strange bedfellows.
Yeah, I guess.
So while there was opposition from the left, like Bernie Sanders, Patrick Leahy, there was also people on the right, like Mike Lee and Rand Paul, opposing this. So maybe even though we've lost the center, there's some hope on the fringes.
I don't know. The overlap between the more libertarian Republicans and some progressives has existed for a while, but it only exists on some issues, right? So I get what you're saying. Yeah, there are some people in the Republican Party with an R next to their name that will overlap with some progressives on these issues, but they're not really people that can be counted on big picture to advance a progressive agenda. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. Remember the name Oleg Deripaska? He's that rich Russian dude who's in the aluminum industry, billionaire, influential guy. He's the same rich Russian that was one of the people paying Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager and chairman, for all sorts of influence peddling work. He's the same guy that Paul Manafort wrote a memo to, which we previously reported on. This is the same Oleg Deripaska that was working with Paul Manafort to sell Ukrainian television assets. Remember when Paul Manafort wrote a memo in 2005 to Oleg where he said, "We are now of the belief that this model can greatly benefit the Putin government if employed at the correct levels with the appropriate commitment to success. The effort will be offering a great service that can refocus both internally and externally the policies of the Putin government." That guy, the guy who had as his highest priority to advance the agenda of the Putin government, Paul Manafort, in contact with Russian billionaire Oleg Deripaska. But those connections were all before the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. And of course, if you listen to the Republicans that defend Trump and Manafort and Deripaska, they didn't have anything to do together with the Trump campaign, right? Wrong. Paul Manafort was offering rich Russian influence peddler Oleg Deripaska private briefings on the status of the Trump campaign while he was the campaign manager / chairman of the Trump campaign. We have now learned that 2 weeks before Donald Trump officially became the Republican presidential nominee, Paul Manafort contacted Oleg Deripaska through an intermediary saying, quote, "If he needs private briefings, we can accommodate." That was July 7th, 2016. We don't know whether the briefings that were offered by Manafort were ultimately provided to Deripaska. We don't know anything beyond that Paul Manafort offered them to Oleg Deripaska. But the willingness for a Trump official to privately and directly brief a seemingly random Russian billionaire about an American presidential campaign is odd, to say the very least.
Well, the thing is, so much that goes on within a presidential campaign is already public. The public sees it all unfold, maybe, the strategies that they have, the speeches that they give. Even if you had an outside interest and you wanted Trump to win, you could see how it's going.
You can learn a lot.
The only reason that you need a private briefing is that you have some deal going on.
That's the question. Why would you need to be briefing such a person if there's no operational connections going on? And even the language Manafort used in this email is very indicative of the sort of power dynamics of this relationship. Manafort is running an American presidential campaign for the candidate that is almost the Republican presidential nominee. And he is willing to accommodate a Russian billionaire to talk about the campaign. What? And they didn't collude, right? They merely accommodated Russian billionaires. And for someone who's been framed, as Paul Manafort has, as a very small player in the Trump campaign, right? Manafort, he was like an intern back stuffing envelopes for us. I barely even remember who Paul Manafort is. It's weird that he is the guy offering direct briefings to Russian billionaires, isn't it?
Yeah, around the time where Trump was getting the nomination, 4 or 5 months in the key time of the campaign. That's all.
He has the time to all the other things he's doing, brief Russian billionaires. And just as a reminder, by the way, I know we joke about this often. But I want to remind you how false the notion is that Paul Manafort was some insignificant minor player. Check out how Paul Manafort was introduced by Reince Priebus over the during that summer of the campaign.
I'd like to call upon Paul Manafort, the campaign chairman and manager and all of the above, for Donald Trump, who will be the next president of the United States. Thank you.
Manafort was such a big player that Priebus joked about how he does everything. He's doing everything. He's the manager, and he's the chairman, and he's all of the above. Some intern in the back hallway. He was actually the guy who was replacing the paper towels in the staff kitchen. I don't know what he did here.
Well, Priebus is gone too now, so he's irrelevant as well.
Yeah, it didn't go so well for Priebus either, that's for sure. So we're getting closer and closer to Manafort's going down, right? He's supposedly about to be indicted. We had that report for you earlier this week. And remember that he has insisted endless times that he has done nothing wrong, that he had nothing to do with Russian involvement in the 2016 presidential campaign, yet he was offering Russian billionaires private briefings about what was going on with the campaign. And this was in July of 2016. Manafort worked for Trump until August. He was actively running the campaign while offering private briefings to a Russian. It's another contradiction. It's another connection, and it's another tie to the Russians. And I really hope that by now someone has seized Manafort's passport, because you have to consider that this guy is a flight risk. And with the indictment leaking, the possibility of the indictment, the supposedly imminent indictment leaking, I hope that they're keeping an eye on this guy. And we have to assume they are. I mean, he's been wiretapped at this point for a very, very long time.
And if he was to flee, it's pretty obvious to assume that he would go to which country?
Probably not Spain. I would
Russia,
assume that he's going to end up in Russia, yeah. Stunning also how much of this is in emails, right? The Trump Tower Russia meetings, Manafort offering stuff to Deripaska. It's great for Mueller that all of this stuff is in emails. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Garrett Plotcher. Garrett, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is viewer, listener, podcaster supported media. You can support the program at davidpakman.com/membership. You can make a contribution at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow and get all the same benefits you would get as a member. And of course, if you ever do shopping on Amazon.com, going to davidpakman.com/Amazon before that shopping is done will support us with every single purchase that you make. Okay, I was on the David Pakman Show Reddit discussion forum this morning. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Reddit. I found some very, very interesting discussions, some of which I will tell you about right now, including a discussion about Sean Spicer at the Emmys. Now, I'm going to address this tomorrow on the program. I think that Sean Spicer being invited to the Emmys to poke fun at himself is actually very, very dangerous, because it normalizes what was hugely damaging lie after deception from Spicer during his tenure as press secretary. So I know people are loving it, Pat, but I have no interest in that kind of nonsense.
Do you think it matters at all that he was more of a puppet as the White House press secretary rather than, you know, like the Secretary of Defense or Health and Human Services and actually making the decisions on the ground?
You could certainly make that case. I think if it matters marginally. I don't think it sort of alleviates the blame that he was a hugely destructive force for the country.
Yes.
Also on our Reddit discussion forum, a major discussion, nearly 100 comments at this point, about my interview earlier this week with fired Google employee James Damore. I'm not going to read over 60 comments to you, but I would encourage you to check out this conversation at davidpakman.com/Reddit and participate if you like. Also on our Reddit discussion forum, the news that just after our interview, James Damore tweeted that one must recognize the positive aspects even of groups like the KKK and neo-Nazis, which was an interesting thing to tweet. And a lot of people saying, it's too bad he didn't tweet that before the interview, David, because that would have been an interesting thing to discuss. And lastly, from our Reddit discussion forum, clarifying the link between hurricanes and climate change. Yeah, we've talked about the link between hurricanes and climate change before. And there's a really interesting post at davidpakman.com/Reddit, sort of going into more detail about the ways in which climate change and hurricanes can be linked. So check that out. Participate. Over 4,000 of our viewers and listeners now at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Okay, last week we had a live caller who expressed himself maybe inarticulately about the fight for $15 as a minimum wage. And he talked about the possibility that, I guess he said a $15 minimum wage could be inefficient and it could have other repercussions that would not be good in the economy. So I thought that it would be a good opportunity, because he followed up clearly on our Reddit discussion forum. I thought it would be a good opportunity to delve into more detail about a $15 minimum wage. And a really important starting point when we talk about the impact of a $15 minimum wage is to remind you that we are talking about a $15 minimum wage, not a $200 minimum wage, $200 an hour minimum wage. And that's for a reason. I've explained it before, but there's this slippery slope argument that some people will make, which is, hey, if a bigger minimum wage is better and 15 is better than 12, then why not make it $200 an hour? And you can't fall for that argument when you're talking with people about the minimum wage. A $200 an hour minimum wage can't be defended in any serious way. It's not an equilibrium wage by any measure of the economy. It's not an inflation-adjusted wage going back to, the creation of the minimum wage. It's not a productivity-adjusted minimum wage. So let's skip the amateurish, slippery slope BS argument of, if a higher minimum wage is good, just raise it even more. We are talking specifically about a $15 minimum wage. There's an argument that is sometimes made, which is you lift the minimum wage, that makes everything get more expensive, and it undoes the impact of the higher minimum wage. And the way it happens is you raise the minimum wage, costs go up for businesses because they've got to pay more in payroll. They then account for that by increasing their prices to avoid going out of business. That disproportionately would impact small businesses who devote a bigger share of revenue to payroll than bigger businesses and are sort of less able to weather rising costs. Okay, solid argument, right? It's a clear argument. Increasing the minimum wage causes inflation and it outdoes any economic benefit. First of all, what does that argument ignore? That argument ignores that if everybody earned more, the business would likely have more customers. And it depends, of course, on the industry, but this is one of the main sort of tenets of of demand side stimulus, which is people have more money to spend at businesses, and that's good for businesses. The other issue that's ignored when you say, well, you add money to the minimum wage, prices go up by the same amount. The problem is people will make two errors in calculation. One is they'll assume that if the minimum wage goes up 20%, all businesses have a 20% increase to payroll expenses. That's not true, though. It only impacts the portion of a business's employees that earn minimum wage. Let me give you an example. If the minimum wage goes from $10 to $15 an hour, that's a 50% increase. And then lots of people start running numbers saying, imagine that payroll costs go up by 50% for all businesses. The payroll increase is only going to be connected to the portion of employees that earn the minimum wage. If only 20% of your employees earn the minimum wage and it goes from $12 to $15, that's a 25% increase only for 20% of your employees, which is a fractional increase to the total payroll expense. The other element to this is that the minimum wage increase, if it's reasonable, is going to be relatively small compared to how much the prices would have to go up. And a case in point, there was a McDonald's study, I believe it was McDonald's, and I should have looked it up, but I believe it was McDonald's, where it showed that you could something like double the minimum wage, and that would hit a pretty significant portion of the employees at McDonald's. But in order to maintain the same profit, they'd only need to raise the price of a Big Mac by 10 cents. Why is that? Because payroll is only a part of total costs, and minimum wage labor are only a part of all labor costs. However, there's a broader argument to discuss. Everything I've told you so far sort of is at the micro level, right? The minimum wage change calculation is wrong. The entire analysis, other than more people will have more money to spend, is a microeconomic analysis. Let's think about this at the macroeconomic level. There's no doubt that some small businesses would be hurt by higher minimum wages. But consider for a second the macroeconomic impact. Business in the US is profitable in total. Doesn't mean every business is profitable. An increase in the minimum wage will increase costs at the macroeconomic level. But at the macro level, most of those costs will come out of the huge business profits that exist. It's not going to put business into the red. Now, you might say, but David, here's a specific business that has a 1% profit margin, and that business will go into the red. Okay, that's a fair argument. But in total, remember that business is profitable in the United States. Profits are redistributed to the rich through bonuses for executives when businesses make big profits, salary increases to the people at the top of the food chain in a lot of these companies, and to shareholders, right? When you have profit in business in publicly traded companies, presumably that profit is redistributed to people who own shares of stock, either through dividends or through an increase in the value of company stock. That's a pretty inefficient allocation of funding. Those rich people, the CEOs that get a cut of the profit, the shareholders who get dividends, they're not going to spend most of that extra money. They're going to put that money away, which is not stimulative to the economy. However, if you take some of that profit and you give it to the employees because of a higher minimum wage, most of that money is getting spent. If you make $28,000 a year and you get a raise to $29,000 a year, you're likely not putting that money into the stock market or into a savings account. You're spending that money in your local community. So I think there's a few issues that are often missed when people talk about the minimum wage. Number one, the fact that we ignore the demand side stimulus of an increase to the minimum wage. Number two, that the increased costs can just come out of profits, which will really disproportionately impact the very rich. You could debate whether that makes sense, but it's hard to argue that that's not an economically stimulative way to redistribute money. You could say it's immoral. You could say it's their money, let them keep it. But the economic multiplier of demand-side stimulus is significant. And it ignores, of course, that the payroll costs are only a fraction of all costs and that minimum wage payroll is only a fraction of all payroll. So, Pat, you've been listening to me rant for a while. Did I explain this in a way that it made, like, your background is not in economics?
No.
But am I sort of making sense? Like, do you have any better understanding of why we hear a lot of bad arguments?
I think so. It would also be a good idea for a long form piece at some point for us. And it's good to point out, too, that it's not just those individual workers who are the beneficiaries of $15 an hour minimum wage. It's also the economy at large.
That's right, yeah. And you have to, it's very easy to try to tear down some of these ideas from a microeconomic perspective with very specific examples from one firm. But you've got to remember, business is profitable, and we've got to think about the macro impact here. And I think that this is a good idea, actually, for a long form piece. And if I were to turn this into a long form piece, I would probably start with a history of the minimum wage in the United States, because that tells us what would the current minimum wage be merely if it had kept up with inflation. What would the minimum wage be if it had kept up with worker productivity, which has risen even faster in the United States?
Or the cost of living, too.
Cost of living is another way that you can adjust the minimum wage. And then we could start looking into the economic impacts of an increase to the minimum wage. And also, I think it would, if we did this as a long form piece, I would want to tap into, you hear from the extreme libertarians, and even I think like Michelle Bachmann once said, there should be no minimum wage. We have data, we have studies that tell us what would happen if there were no minimum wage. And that would be an interesting thing to explore as well.
And that McDonald's study really sticks out to me too, because if it really is only 10 cents extra per burger, I mean, who in their right mind, what consumers would refuse to buy that burger because they have to pay an extra 10 cents knowing that every single worker there is paid $15 an hour?
Well, that happened with Papa John's. Remember this dude from Papa John's Pizza who was big against Obamacare? And it ended up coming out that he would have to add 10 cents to the price of every single pizza in order to give all of his employees health care.
So he raised the price by like 15 cents?
Well, I don't know what he actually did, but when I read that, I said, wait a second, you're telling me this guy's been complaining this aggressively about Obamacare over what would have to be a 10-cent pizza price adjustment to maintain the exact same profit margins?
And I think Forbes looked at that as well, and they're not exactly a left-wing organization. And I think they only found that it would be 7 cents extra.
Oh, okay,
too.
so it was an exaggeration.
So
well,
he was profiting.
Listen, we're rounding up 7 to 10 cents. Yeah, so listen, most of these arguments don't make sense, and I'm glad to keep discussing these in detail, and maybe we will look into this in a long-form format. And you can also participate in the conversation that already is going on about the $15 minimum wage on our Reddit discussion forum at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're continuing our conversation with Rachel Sherman, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the New School in New York, also author of the book Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. Rachel, at the end of the first part, we were talking about sort of the way in which the wealthy individuals you interviewed seemed sort of adapted to their standard of living as a new baseline. Did you sort of experience that yourself? Because there's a point in the book where you write about sort of you were adapting and sympathizing with and having compassion for the difficulties of managing the renovations of 3 properties that someone might have, including one in the Hamptons or whatever. Did you start to sort of see the world through the types of problems that really rich people have as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that example comes up particularly because the women that I had spoken to when I started feeling like that had, I would say, relatively significant problems with their husbands around the control of money. And I just felt very sympathetic to the lack of recognition that they were getting from their husbands. And then I felt like it was distracting me from the fact that the problems that they were talking about had to do with the renovation of the home in the Hamptons or whatever. But the broader issue, I mean, in general, I found it very difficult to retain some level of objectivity, right? We're so used to judging wealthy people and just thinking that their expenditures, are ridiculous or are reasonable or, that they're nice people or bad people or whatever. It's hard to kind of get out of that. But I think I had the advantage of being a relatively experienced, sociological interviewer. So I already know a little bit how to minimize that. But the being caught between the kind of common judgments that circulate about rich people, and to which I'm certainly not immune, and the empathy or the identification that interviewers often feel with the people that they're talking to was a little bit of a fine line to walk.
Yeah, well, in the interviews, you do ask questions that sort of try to get at, and really you have a whole chapter about this, how these wealthy people you spoke to, I don't know if defend is the right way, but I'm going to use that word, and then you can sort of correct me or point me in a better direction. Defend the wealth that they have from a sort of deserving it standpoint. And you would see a lot of different lines of reasoning that in the people you interviewed, right? Listen, we pay lots of taxes, so we're doing what we need to do. We pay the taxes on the money we make, and thus it's okay. Or listen, we still work in other ways. We take care of the kids and do a lot of volunteering or work wherever it is that has some kind of social good, etc. Talk to me a little bit about the defenses of wealth.
Yeah, I'm not sure defenses is a reasonable word. I think justifications might be a better word, although justification kind of has a connotation of insincerity, which I don't think that these people are insincere in talking about this. I think what they're doing is highlighting the content of the judgments that are very broadly made of wealthy people in American culture and possibly elsewhere of, you deserve your wealth if you've worked hard for it, or, a little bit if you still work hard, or if so if you are, as you said, like a stay-at-home mother, you're trying to frame yourself as working even though you're not working for pay. Or if you're an inheritor, you're trying to frame yourself as working in a job even though you know that you didn't actually earn the money that you're living on. But the idea of being a hard worker, whether or not that explains your money, and the idea of consuming not being an ostentatious, materialistic, greedy consumer. And then the idea of giving money back. Some people refer to their taxes, as you said. Many people refer to their charitable contributions or to volunteerism. A lot of people also talked about a kind of obligation to be aware of their privilege. So even though they sort of don't want to talk about it, they also feel like they need privately to recognize it. And they want to raise kids who are also sort of morally worthy, good people, and who themselves have all of these traits. So in those ways, they kind of draw these distinctions between people who are entitled, who are morally worthy of wealth, and people who are not.
So other than, I mean, you talked about the more progressive people that you spoke to tended to have more liberal guilt about their wealth, but sort of more putting aside the broader political identification, were there specific factors you found that made some wealthy people more attuned to issues of wealth inequality and the problems of the less wealthy and the poor than others, whether it's, they inherited money versus they earned it through work or investments or whatever else? What other factors might we point to?
Well, I think people, this is, again, it's kind of the opposite of the inheritor piece, but people who are actually upwardly mobile are more, they have family members and friends from their childhoods or, communities of origin who have much less than they do. So those people also tend to, keep others in their mind. And the people who have really a lot of wealth, they're not upwardly mobile in the traditional sense, and that many of them started middle class or upper middle class to begin with. But then if you have $50 million, you are upwardly mobile relative to what you started with. So they have a consciousness about that too. And I think a lot of these people they're not unaware that like poor people exist, right? I think they all know that. One of the things I think that happens in stereotypes of rich people is that we imagine that rich people are kind of incredibly stupid and shallow. These are very well-educated people who live in the world. So they know that people who have less than they do exist. It's just partly a question of how they manage that knowledge. And some of them take a much more kind of charitable approach, which says, we're never going to change this system. It's not my job to change the system. I'm entitled to this because I work hard and I'm a nice person and I'm a reasonable parent. So I'm going to give some money away and, I'm not going to be that conflicted about it. Those people still feel the need that I was just talking about to be morally worthy, right? They still don't want to show off their money. They don't want to hoard their money. They don't want their kids to be obnoxious or entitled, right? The concept of entitlement is something that across the board, my respondents really didn't like. But the way that they sort of see those obligations does vary.
It's interesting that you talk about, these are not stupid people or ignorant people. They're well educated. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, there's been a lot of different studies about how wealth can sort of change one's perception of reality. There's studies about the reduction of compassion on average of wealthier people. There's this UC Berkeley study, which showed that there will be sort of a rationalization of advantage by convincing oneself that they deserve it. And you explore that in the book with this idea of, hey, I worked hard, etc. Studies that show even sort of mundane things like richer people are more likely to ignore pedestrians, or there's a UCSF study about the wealthier you are, the worse you are on average at reading the facial expressions of others, this type of thing. What's your thought after doing all the research and interviews for your book about all of that research that's out there?
Yeah, a lot of that research relies on social psychological methods, sort of experimental methods that take place in laboratories. And I think those kinds of methods, sometimes just get at something different than what I'm looking at. And I think that we have so little research on rich people. It may be, one explanation would be like there's different kinds of rich people, and some of them, have all of the traits, the sort of negative traits that have been identified in these primarily social psychological studies. And some of them have, a stronger moral compass of the kind that I'm identifying or whatever. But I also just think that these are different aspects of having the experience of having privilege. So, talking explicitly with me about some of these issues is going to be different from how people are going to be in a lab, although it does matter which people are in the lab, which is another part of this. And I think what's important is to just keep exploring these differences and these kind of characteristics, because I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive, right? And the point that I'm trying to emphasize is not so much like rich people are moral, right? That, they're not as evil as we think that they are. My point is more about thinking well, why are we invested in judging them as moral or not moral? And what are the criteria that we're using to do that? So do we really think that in a society with the levels of inequality that we are currently seeing, that it is okay to be, to have $10 million or $50 million or $50 billion, just, on the basis of being a nice person or having worked hard or, not living in a McMansion, right? And these are the criteria that my respondents are laying out. And they are also criteria that I think resonate with people who aren't rich or certainly aren't as rich as they are.
Do you know how many of the people you interviewed have read the book, and is anybody upset about how they were portrayed?
I don't know, and I don't know. I do care, and I would be interested to know. I mean, again, I have really tried to not do what I think a lot of people might do in this kind of research, which is be really voyeuristic or, kind of talk a lot about their homes or the spending that they do have, and make the judgment myself that they are or are not reasonable consumers, right? That, for example, that's a totally relative category, and I just want to take myself out of making those judgments. I think that some of them may appreciate that I'm trying to understand and represent their perspective. But on the other hand, I have ended up talking about things that I think are hard for many of them to talk about. And yeah, that might be something that they don't like. I have gone very far out of my way to preserve their anonymity. So I hope that makes a difference too.
We've been speaking about the book Uneasy Street, The Anxieties of Affluence. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Rachel Sherman. Thanks so much for talking to me about it. I found the book super interesting.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Donald Trump is having a tough week. His former campaign manager and campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, is allegedly going to be indicted. He then threatened genocide against North Korea at what might have been the most internationally embarrassing United Nations speech in history. And he has now praised a country that does not exist. When I heard that Donald Trump would be lunching with African leaders, my ears perked up right away, because that is just ripe for disaster. And of course, by disaster, I mean comedy gold. And it was. Donald Trump praised the great work by the country of Nambia, which is, of course, not a country. Here is Donald Trump.
In Guinea and Nigeria, you fought a horrifying Ebola outbreak. Nambia's health system is increasingly self-sufficient.
And it was not just once, but it was at least twice. Here's Donald Trump again talking about the great country of Nambia.
And I'm greatly honored to host this lunch, to be joined by the leaders of Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Nambia, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, and South Africa.
I guess it's a portmanteau of Zambia and Namibia, right?
And the Gambia, too.
And the Gambia?
Yes.
What's the Gambia?
Another country.
The Gambia?
Yes.
I didn't know it was the. Interesting. Well, of course Nambia is more self-sufficient now. They're doing huge trade with Lambwanda, which is, of course, a country from referenced in Mission Impossible. There's a fake white supremacist African country called Lambwanda. Reminds me of the Erdogan incident. Remember when Donald Trump, standing next to Turkish President Erdogan, referred to him as Erdogan?
It is a great pleasure to welcome President Erdogan for his first visit to the White House in years. The American and Turkish peoples have been friends and allies for many, many decades.
The Kabfefi trade in Nambia is amazing. They've got some really nice light roasts, and they're just doing huge business. Beautiful country. Beautiful, beautiful country. Things did not go well in general with various UN delegations. Here's a picture of the Zimbabwean delegation, including Robert Mugabe, appearing to sleep through Donald Trump's speech yesterday or the day before, where he referred to Rocket Man and the total destruction of North Korea. If you're threatening genocide against a country and Mugabe isn't excited enough to stay awake for it, you know something weird is going on. That 2/5 at minimum of the Zimbabwean delegation sleeping through the Donald Trump speech.
Well, I think the gaffe at the luncheon yesterday is actually pretty significant because I'm sure all those African leaders went into it understanding that Donald Trump doesn't really care.
Yeah.
And that's verified if he doesn't even take the time to learn the pronunciation of the country.
Well, not only that, but it's all fun and games. Nambia, yeah, it's all funny. Lambwanda. Donald Trump did say some horrible things at that lunch with the African leaders. And Donald Trump sort of bragged about how his friends are going to Africa to get rich. Here's Donald Trump talking about that. And this really is a serious thing. Take a look at this.
Africa has tremendous business potential. I have so many friends going to your countries trying to get rich. I congratulate you. They're spending a lot of money.
That is just horrible, right? Trump's bragging about the raping and pillaging of the resources of African countries, and he loves it, right? I mean, for centuries, Africa's resources have been exploited by Europeans and Americans, Africa victimized by the slave trade of Europe and the United States. The U.S. has supported dozens of authoritarian and just brutal regimes in Africa, and the making of billions upon billions of dollars from deals with dictatorships and the pillaging of conflict minerals. It's a horrible reality we're in when Donald Trump is sort of saying, it's just, my friends are going to Africa and they're just getting rich. It's so fantastic. Congratulations.
Right, well, at least his buddies are getting rich, though. Silver lining.
Well, that is actually the only connection to a real philosophy of Donald Trump. We can't really learn anything about Donald Trump's philosophy on free trade from what he says. It's just kind of what he heard and an idea he came up with that he thought would do well with voters. His real philosophy, what Trump is really impressed by, is by his friends going to Africa and figuring out a way to use the resources of Africa to enrich themselves. Greed, self-aggrandizement, those are the real philosophies that get Donald Trump excited. And that's a genuine moment. This is, it's so incredible because it's such a great example. Trump genuinely seems like he understands his friends are getting rich in Africa, and he really seems pleased by it. That's the window into the real Trump. Thrilled about people getting rich off of others' resources.
And this story made me look into past mispronunciations by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Some of my favorites, 2 Corinthians, which we all know about.
Of course, 2 Corinthians.
Beyonce. And Tanzania, another African country you may not have heard of.
Tanzania I am familiar with, interestingly enough. The Copfefi trade has actually destroyed Tanzania, has really hurt Nambia, but in Tanzania it hasn't worked well. Hey, I told you this was going to happen, and it did. Remember when Donald Trump said that Obama wiretapped him? It goes back to these now infamous tweets. One tweet in which Donald Trump said, "Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism." And then another tweet where Donald Trump said, "How low has President Obama gone to tap my phones during the very sacred election process? This is Nixon Watergate, bad or sick guy." I've actually made that bad or sick guy thing part of my Instagram profile because I think it's so funny. Bad, and then in parentheses, or sick guy.
How about tap with 2 T's?
Tap, well,
it was
a double tap. Yeah, tap
okay.
with 2 P's. It's because it was a double tap of Trump's phone. Okay, so earlier this week, we learned Paul Manafort was wiretapped. And I told you, there are going to be right-wingers who see this, Trump included, and they will say, hey, Trump's vindicated. Manafort was wiretapped. That means Trump was right. Obama wiretapped Trump at Trump Tower. Case closed. And it's happening, including on Fox News. Here's Tucker Carlson, one example.
Last spring, President Trump drove official Washington into hyperventilation by publicly claiming the Obama administration had wiretapped members of his campaign staff at his office at Trump Tower prior to the last election.
Now, that introduction is already deceptive because Trump tweeted that he was wiretapped, and Tucker Carlson is already sort of teeing up the distortion by saying Trump was talking about his entire staff being wiretapped. Anyway, let's continue now, more with Tucker.
According to a new report from CNN, Paul Manafort, who for a time last year was Trump's campaign chairman, was wiretapped by the federal government both before and after the election. Now, Manafort, it ought to be noted, had an apartment inside Trump Tower during that time. So it's virtually certain that surveillance of him would have included other members of the Trump campaign staff, maybe even Trump himself. Right. In other words, it looks like Trump's tweet may have been right,
No, that is not true. I'll explain why. It wasn't just Tucker Carlson. Fox News pundit Sean Hannity also said during his Tuesday show, Trump, quote, has been proven right about wiretapping. Long list of examples that we could go through, but bottom line is I predicted it and it's happening. People claiming Trump was vindicated about Obama wiretapping him. Now, legal experts are in a tizzy. They are all over Fox News. They are all over right-wing media because Donald Trump has not been vindicated here. Trump made 3 claims. 1, he was wiretapped. 2, it was at Trump Tower. And 3, Obama did the wiretapping. Number 1, was Donald Trump wiretapped? No evidence of that. If Donald Trump was speaking to Manafort while Manafort was under surveillance, then Donald Trump would incidentally appear in those records or recorded conversations, but there is still no evidence that Trump was wiretapped. Number 2, it was at Trump Tower. And the argument is, well, Paul Manafort had an apartment at Trump Tower, so Trump Tower was wiretapped, so Donald Trump is vindicated. Well, maybe. We don't actually know if Manafort had a landline phone at Trump Tower or whether it was his mobile phone or Google Voice or email or whatever that was under surveillance. But in any case, the spirit of Trump saying he was wiretapped at Trump Tower is that the Trump organization was wiretapped or the Trump offices or maybe Trump's specific office or mobile phone or whatever. This is specific surveillance of Paul Manafort, who had an apartment at Trump Tower, but this is not the spirit of what Trump said, which is Trump Tower was wiretapped to eavesdrop on Trump.
And we just knew initially that this would be a horrible political move for Donald Trump because either he's wrong and then he looks like he's lying or just disconnected from reality, and It seems like James Comey verified that idea, or that there was some warrant that warranted him getting wiretapped in the first place.
That's right. And that gets us to part 3, which is how do you do these how do you get warrants to do this type of wiretapping? Part 3 of Trump's assertion was Obama did the wiretapping. That's obviously bogus, right? This was the Justice Department and the FBI who got FISA warrants, which a judge has to sign off on, period. There's no evidence, nor would it be the operating process. It wouldn't be within the scope of how this works that President Obama was at all involved in this. So what Pat is getting to is another point, which is if indeed Donald Trump was wiretapped, which we still have no evidence of, and Trump has provided no evidence of, despite having teased that he was very close to giving us something about that. If Trump was wiretapped, it's because intelligence and law enforcement went to a judge and had something that made the judge say, this is enough for me to approve a wiretap. So either way, it's really bad for Trump. It happens to be the furthest thing from a vindication of Trump.
And remember, Trump never gave any evidence to validate his claims that he made, too.
And people forgot.
And he's president. He should be able to find those.
Remember, there was going to be a Melania Trump press conference to explain the still not disproven assertion that she was working in the United States illegally. There was going to be a press conference really soon. Press conference never happened. Donald Trump told us, very soon, you're going to be hearing about the entire Obama wiretapped me thing. Never heard about it. It just goes away. It just disappears because there's 20, 30, or 40 other lies or scandals that end up taking their place.
I'm sure there are scheduling conflicts.
Oh, yeah. He's just super busy. Super busy. He's actually working on a farm in Nambia, mining cobfefi or something like that. 2192 David P. Why am I mentioning that? Because that's our voicemail number. You can call anytime. You can call from anywhere. And here is a Georgia inmate who called in demanding, asking pretty politely, actually, that the David Pakman Show be broadcast in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Take a listen to this.
Hi, yo, David, man. All right, look, I'm a big fan of your show, all right? Look, listen, I'm kind of locked up in the county right now, all right? Look, this is my one phone call. I'm going to use it on you. This is my only phone call I'm using on you, brother. All right, look, listen, you should try to get your TV show, like, in county lockups, man. 'Cause I'm telling you, man, we got TV here, but it ain't great, man. It's boring. Just try to hook us up. All right, look, I'm in Gwinnett County, Georgia. Why don't you start there, all right? All right, peace, brother.
Okay. So I did a little bit of research. Gwinnett County, I believe, does have a public television station. So if we have any people who listen to or watch the show in Gwinnett County, you can contact Gwinnett County Television and ask them to broadcast the David Pakman Show. It costs nothing to them, right? We provide the show to public radio and television stations as what I believe is a public service. And I would be glad to have the show on in Gwinnett County. I mean, why not, right?
I just love how this person had one phone call to make, and he chose 219 David P.
I
mean,
think
good thing we have a catchy phone number.
That's kind of a joke, I think, right? Because I think when you're in lockup, you get multiple phone. He's joking about the one phone call when you're initially arrested, but I think once you're there, you have phone privileges, often at absurdly inflated prices. There's serious price gouging going on.
And it was worth it to him.
Apparently, it was worth it to request the David Pakman Show. So let's come through and let's get the show on in Gwinnett County public television. On the bonus show today, Jimmy Kimmel thrown into the Trump Care 3.0 debate. We will talk about heat, which will likely kill more people in 2017 than all major hurricanes combined in the United States. And lastly, 7 countries are banning fossil fuel-based cars. Are these bona fide bans on cars, or is it political posturing? We will talk about that and much more on the bonus show. DavidPakman.com/membership. Patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Contributions on either of those 2 platforms will get you access to the world-famous bonus show. I will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at DavidPakman.com.